Welcome to another episode of the Heroic Hotline, where we talk about things important to you men out there. And this week is no different. We have a huge treat. We have Matthew Sanders from Longbeard. He's the founder of Magisterium AI, and he's agreed to join us and help us understand exactly where this is going and what it's all about. Welcome, Matthew.
Thanks for having me.
So, Matthew, maybe tell us a little bit about yourself. How does one found an AI company? And
Well, I didn't set out to found an AI company. I started my career in the military as an infantry officer. I eventually ended up being in seminary, and then coming out after a few years working for the government, I ended up working for Cardinal Collins, the Archdiocese of Toronto. It was there I kind of realized that technology, the profound effect it was having on culture and the opportunity for evangelization, if the technology was better used by the church. So ultimately, we decided to leave the Archdiocese and to found the company Longbeard. Again, initially, we were just trying to solve the problem of how do we get the church to leverage technology more effectively for evangelization. That work eventually led us to Rome, working for the Holy See and other Catholic organizations around the world. And while we were working there, we ended up working with Google on some projects, and that got us interested in more emerging tech. We didn't immediately see an application for AI at the time, but we started following the field a lot more closely. And it wasn't until, like everyone else, when ChatGPT dropped and we looked at the product and we learned that lots of Catholics were using it. They were asking it spiritual questions and things. And it was a great product, but we knew it also had some downsides. And so we started basically a project to see if we could mitigate those downsides and find a way to leverage it safely, faithfully for the church. And it turned out we could, at least what we thought with hard work, we could. And so we launched it in July of 2023. There's a funny story with the launching of it, but basically that's when we decided soon after that to pivot the entire company to solely focus on building and scaling Catholic AI, which is now the mission of the company.
so we're always up for a funny story on the launch. So
when we launched it in July 2023, initially we did so because we were trying to entice theologians, philosophers, diocesan officials, canon lawyers to test the product. And we launched it with initially, I think, 600 documents is what I had access to. The ones you'd expect, the Code of Canon Law, the Catechism, the compendiums, and so on. And then EWTN found out what we were doing and asked to do an interview. And in hindsight, it was probably foolish. I did the interview, and then it went viral. And then we had so much traffic, we got crashed. We couldn't get back up again because we were exceeding all the rate limits with OpenAI at the time. And then, ironically, it was actually Sam Altman who stepped in, who's the CEO of OpenAI. He stepped in to actually help put us back in business. And so, I jokingly say if it wasn't for Sam Altman, I don't think Magisterium AI would be here today, at least not in the form it currently is. But what that whole exercise kind of demonstrated for us is that there was a real interest and a need for a product like this. And so, like I said, that to us was sufficient traction to pivot the company behind this project. At least that was the first phase. And then we in building Catholic AI, we realized it wasn't just as simple as, building a kind of a ChatGPT like product. There's a lot more involved in building Catholic AI. And that's how we ended up getting into more and more areas of artificial intelligence.
so you said you started with some basic documents. How far down the road are you in loading in official church teachings and stuff like that?
Well, I think it's over 27,000 documents now. So most of the foundational teaching would be in there. We still have a lot more work to do, but the core of the council documents, the Eridicon, the works of Thomas Aquinas, all these works are in there. Kind of the seminal works. There's still a lot more doctrines of the church and church fathers collective works we still need to get in there. We have a good chunk of them, but there's still more to do there. And the most recent project we've initiated, and I say recent as in like the last kind of year and change, is we're looking to actually digitize the patrimony of the church. So going well beyond the kind of core foundational teaching to try and capture basically everything that's kind of been said philosophically and theologically. And that means going into the libraries, particularly in Rome. And so we built a product called Vulgate, which was built at the behest, at the invitation of the Pontifical Oriental Institute to help them digitize their library and then democratize access to it. Their constituency was the Middle East and East Africa, and those people flying to Rome to pull books out of the stacks. Obviously, the rector wasn't like thrilled at that. And of course, Pope Francis had been talking a lot about reaching the peripheries. And so he came to us and said, is there a way we can digitize this library and make it available to everyone on earth in their native language on any device? And so that was kind of the mission. So at the time, we thought that was kind of a daunting task, but we realized with AI that actually this isn't so daunting as we had thought. And so we built Vulgate really to solve for two problems. One was to find a way to scale up ingest. So because when you scan a book, this is just one example. You have to run OCR, optical character recognition, on it. And that's basically to help extract the information from the scanned images. But that technology doesn't work all that well. So typically what ends up happening is once you're finished extracting, then you have to go and someone has to clean the data, like label all the data. And then essentially, if you want to make it language agnostic, meaning that if you want to make the text understandable in any language by anyone, then you have to convert it to something called vector embeddings, which is like creating a mathematical representation of what the meaning of the words. So this whole process obviously is pretty intense and took a lot of time. You had to have a human in the loop, which is expensive as well. So we realized with the AI we could automate this process. So that's kind of the first phase of Vulgate was how do we integrate directly into the robo scanners? These are like robots that are these arms that turn pages for books when you put them down. So we bought those and then hook into the scanner, and as the scanning job's finished, it goes up to Vulgate, which then processes it and then deposits all the information in a vector database. Then once you have it in there, then you can use Vulgate so that using neural search or keyword search, you can kind of search across basically the contents of this library. And again, what's compelling about it is I can ask a question in my own language, and that question is then converted into a vector, which is like, again, a mathematical expression of the meaning of my search query. And then it can use that to search the entire library, which means it can extract insights in Greek, right? It can extract and ancient Syriac and all kinds of other languages. It can extract those insights and then translate them back to me in my own language. And so what it does is it democratizes access, to these holdings in a way that was only really possible for the most elite scholars in the world. So, anyways, this was an important problem to solve for us. One, because it was just cool and needed to be done. The other reason is we, in learning to train models more, we needed more Catholic data. And so, by solving this problem of library digitization, it helps them democratize their holdings and helps us get our hands on more data. And then, of course, with us, everything we scan and everything we digitize, which is, it's it doesn't have copyright issues, we then make it available to people through Magisterium AI for free. So we're about to start scaling up this operation. So I'm pretty excited about the next 6 months. We should be able to double, triple what we currently have in our knowledge base. And I expect that to be to really help the AI, especially people that are exploring kind of deeper research questions.
Well, and that's incredible that just a couple prompts I can search this amount of information, and it got me thinking as you're talking about those high scholars. So now what do they do when the AI does it for me, a layman who that's where does this lead if it does it for me, kind of thing? This research, I want to research on St. Joseph. St. Joseph's a good buddy of mine, so where did the litany of St. Joseph come from? And where you used to have to do all this referencing, where it's doing it for me now, right? So
Right. Well, I mean, what I hope is it'll just save time and energy. I mean, one thing that, I think probably a lot of people in academics would probably acknowledge is it seems like a lot of the dissertations that are produced in these universities tend to cover a lot of the same material. And that's not by accident, right? And that's mainly because, there's a certain core curriculum and that's the curriculum you study in order to get your master's. And so, of course, in the course of studying your master's degree, because everyone's reviewing the same curriculum, similar questions tend to pop up, right? And so you tend to go over the same material again and again. Always original questions and ideas, but it can kind of narrow the field of academia a little bit. So what's cool about AI? I mean, when we go into these libraries and we digitize these books, some of them haven't been open in like 100 years, right?
yeah.
And so when we go in there and we digitize them, and then we add them to this vector database so that people can query them and extract insights. When someone asks a question, all of a sudden there's an insight coming from a book and an author they'd never heard about before, right? And so then they look at it and say, wow, this is really interesting. There's something here. I think I want to study this. And as it happens, nobody's written on that subject in in ages, right? So I think in this way, it'll actually provide like more interesting research areas and therefore more interesting content and material and hopefully insight into the faith. So that's one thing. I think the other thing it does is it allows a lot more people to engage in like theological research and deposit new ideas. Because frankly, yes, doing original research on a lot of these subjects just wasn't available to most people because the books weren't digitized.
Yeah.
And also because some of these texts are they're in languages that people understand. So now that that's no longer a barrier, more people can go in there with their questions and they can kind of jump into rabbits holes and then come out of it and perhaps make a contribution to the Catholic intellectual tradition, and that gets me really excited. I mean, the other thing is I think that there's a lot of really profound insight probably in these books that would be applicable to even the average person who's just kind of dealing with things like the problem of evil and things like that. So
Yeah.
by going there and digitizing all this information, it could be that some of those insights actually will be very useful to people and could help hopefully improve their lives.
Yeah, and that unlocks a vast amount of works. And I forget where the quote came from. I think I saw it in Conversation with God. Was, if you read only modern works, you'll make ancient errors, kind of
Right.
thing. So having unlocking this richness of our history. So the former Grand Seminary in Montreal, my understanding is it's got a library of like 500,000 books. So if you ever get there, like, it's yeah, it's hard to even fathom or comprehend the vastness of what you're doing for us. Like, do you foresee, you're doing it in a Catholic context, but like there's the Library of Congress in the US, which is massive, right? So d-
Yeah.
or,
Yeah. I mean, totally. I mean, Vulgate was initially built to solve a very particular problem, but the technology can be used really, I mean, for any library, or that's what we're finding now. The company that we're working with produces the world's most advanced robo scanners called SMA out of Germany. I mean, they have clients in government and things like that. There's large corporations and it's a big problem, right? Scanning and then finding ways to automate that ingestion process. And so as it just turns out that the problem that we solve for to help the pontifical universities and help us get more data is a problem that a lot of these companies have been looking to solve for a long time. And so it looks like the platform will be used in innumerable use cases. So that that's citing like generally, because obviously there's wisdom and insight that's profound and meaningful that goes outside of the Catholic intellectual and
yeah.
philosophical traditions. We want to make sure that's all captured. But I think that the big thing for us is ultimately, I think, as we enter this AI and robotics era, and there's a lot of people I think that will be challenged by these new technologies and question their worth. We foresee a lot some people having existential crises, right? And so when those crises emerge, where do they go with their tough questions as they try and work through this? And what we're hoping is by digitizing more and more of this Catholic insight, that it actually can be useful to people in helping work through some of these issues and reminding them of their fundamental dignity and what life is all about. That there is always going to be work to be done, and that their lives matter.
So the process of verifying the scan picked up what was written and actually translated it properly, that must have been uh, extremely tedious work to ensure that this, or how does that come about, or because there's got to be some testing mechanism to ensure that you're capturing what you're scanning, right?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, so one way to answer this question is everything that is digitized is is vectorized, so it's converted to these into basically math to make it intelligible by the AIs, but it's also retained in in regular plain text, and so there's a link between the plain text and the actual vector embedding. So that ensures that if when somebody asks a question and let's say in Vulgate, like in Magisterium AI, it generates an answer. It provides citations. And so you can actually click those citations and look at the original text. And so in that way, that the insight that the AI is providing to you is grounded. And that was one of the things with Magisterium AI when we built it. I mean, there's kind of two primary problems we were trying to solve with Magisterium AI. One is to mitigate this issue of hallucinations. How do we mitigate hallucinations? This propensity for AIs to make things up. because they're eager to please. So that was one issue. How far can we go with mitigating those hallucinations? And the other was, how do we provide greater transparency? So when an AI generates an answer, how do I know that answer is true, that it's correct? And so these models are trained on the entirety of all text on the internet, right? Which includes scholarly works, Catholic theological, philosophical works. But when they generate an answer, they don't provide citations. Now they're starting to do that more, where they'll kind of go do reverse RAG, where they'll go and find citations on the web and stuff, and they'll try and justify that which they've said. But again, like we know in the Catholic intellectual tradition, especially for those Roman Catholics, obviously the Magisterium is something that we take very seriously. It's official church teaching. Finding a source on the web is not sufficient. So we wanted to make sure that when the AI is extracting documents, so someone asks a question, and one AI goes and finds documents that are relevant to answering that question and extracts those documents. Those documents are official in some way, or have at least passed some kind of muster. And that way, when the AI is reviewing those documents and then choosing to generate an answer, we know that it's generating that answer on quality contents, and it provides citations, so we know with every assertion it makes what that assertion is grounded in. And so Vulgate is basically built all along the same lines. So that's one way to answer the question around the transparency. The other thing is more technically, this process of converting plain text into mathematical expressions of the meaning of the words, so trying to capture the semantic meaning. This is done through something called an embedding model. And so these embedding models are deterministic. So it means that you have a deterministic outcome. So and this is different than generative AI models, which are non-deterministic, right? When you ask a question, the output it's an output of it's a statistical probability, and it can vary, right? Depending upon what you ask it, the way you ask it, what word you choose to in your sentence, the outcome can change every time. Whereas in deterministic models, like these embedding models, that's not the case. And so when it's going through the process of basically attaching semantic meaning to a particular word, that's a deterministic path, and we can kind of track that whole process to ensure that's being done accurately. And so the leading embedding models that are used by the major AI labs have been trained on billions and billions of tokens, and are good across multiple languages, and are benchmarked by the industry. So they tend to be fairly accurate. Now there is some like Catholic theological and philosophical like nuance, right? Some of the words we use are highly technical. So we do think that there's value in training a Catholic embedding model, and so that's something eventually we'll do, more like a fine tuning operation. But that's a little bit down the road.
Wow. Okay. And you answered one of the questions of one of my coworkers about the hallucinating thing, and and one of the guys I was talking to yesterday, when we were talking about this subject, he said his wife had put in some parameters about a poem by this author with this criteria kind of thing, and it spit something out, and because she was familiar with the author, she didn't sound right. And she asked again, well, was this actually written by the author? No, it was my creation based on what you were looking for in the tone of the author. So, but if you didn't know to ask that follow-up question, then you would have accepted that as a poem from this author. So like you say, they're eager to please. Your Magisterium AI didn't want to please me today, though. When I was playing around with it, I've been using it a bit, and I like having the references that you talk about. But I asked it to create an image of Saint create an image for heroic men of Saint Joseph, Terror of Demons, and it said, we don't promote violence on this Terror of Demons.
Yeah, and it wouldn't generate images anyway, because we don't allow it to.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So where the other ones do, like Gemini, and it was
Yeah,
kind of
correct.
a
I mean,
weird.
Magisterium AI is a very particular form of AI. It's not to say that in the future we wouldn't have more capabilities along those lines, but tuning so I shouldn't say it's not just simply a matter of tuning. There's a lot of Magisterium AI is a compound AI system, so it's a bunch of technologies that work together to ensure faithful answers. Ensuring that it's faithful just in text is a big challenge. Trying to get a diffusion model to generate images that are faithful would be a very different kind of challenge, and that's not one we're willing to take on right now, right? So Yeah, if you're looking to you're looking for like creative stuff, I do not recommend Magisterium AI. That's not its strong suit. Its strong suit is basically representing the mind of the church in providing an answer, right? I mean, that's what it's told to. When you ask it a question, look at what the church has said and try as best you can to distill what the church has said for that particular person, right? In response to their query. And that's kind of like that's the narrowness of the AI, and for the time being, those are kind of the bounds we want to keep it within.
So for authorship, so I reflected and wrote a novena plus one on Saint Joseph, Terror of Demons, and then I've chewed on it for over a year now, and then I actually ran it through Magisterium AI because I do like the product just to see, and I said rewrite the following, and it did. Now, whose work does it become? Do what as an author? What do I have to? Is this a Magisterium AI product? Is this something that I wrote? So where does that line become
Yeah,
for?
I mean, just like with ChatGPT, I mean, if you go in there and you generate an output, ChatGPT doesn't say that we now have license of that output. That output belongs to us, right? So we have a similar terms of service to the other large language models. I mean, every output is generally speaking unique unless it's a cached response, which wouldn't make sense at least in most cases. So I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I think that's a question of the age, right? When you work with an AI to generate an output, I mean, whose work is it? Is it the AI's? Is it yours? And I think the answer is both.
Yeah,
I mean, of course you want to acknowledge that you worked with an LLM on it, but I think ultimately you can say that. I mean, for the answer to be interesting and novel, there's a role that human beings have to play in that, right? Otherwise, what you're just going to get a pattern matched, response based upon its training data, or in our case, the knowledge of contents that it has. So I think there's a large kind of realm of possibilities here. I think that creativity is possible working with large language model, and I mean I use it all the time, mainly because agonizing over grammar and structure and syntax, or looking for citations to add to my answer, and creative exploration, ideation. Large language models are very helpful in this, especially if you're doing it on like a Catholic and philosophical theological topic. I mean, obviously, I haven't like memorized everything I've seen and read in those when I was in seminary, right? I can't recall it perfectly. LLMs can, and so there's obviously an enormous benefit to being able to ask them a question and to know that it's searching through 27,000 texts to see what there is relevant. I mean, you think about the old days, right? How much time that would have taken. I mean, it could have taken you half a lifetime, right? 27,000
oh
texts. I
yeah,
mean, you have to go page by page, right? And so this technology, I think, has enormous opportunities to advance research to help really kind of like and put fuel behind people's like own imaginations and creativity. But again, like yes, I mean, if you always have to make sure that whatever you're generating, if you truly want to make it your own, that you take the opportunity to rewrite it, so it has more of your kind of your character
yeah.
of writing.
So one of the questions from one of my coworkers is, what have they learned from using the tool that maybe surprised them, such as new associations between ideas?
Well, I mean, one thing that surprised me when we launched the product is initially we had thought, especially in the early days, that people would be coming to it primarily to ask pretty straight up catechetical questions. And that was, namely because we thought it was going to appeal to teachers and to priests. Maybe they're about to teach an RCA class and things like that, and parents. But what surprised us was how many people were going there and asking very personal questions. So that they're presenting a personal situation and asking, like, what would the church say to me in this situation? Which required the AI to kind of generalize from first principles to that situation. Now, in the early days, when the model's intelligence was not that high and our knowledge base wasn't that extensive, this was a problem that we took very seriously. And so it basically meant that we had to kind of strategically shift the strategy of the company to focus more on ingest, trying to digitize everything we possibly could, just to ensure that as much official context was brought to bear on these situations as possible, so that we didn't have to rely on the AI to generalize. And so, actually, what was interesting about this whole process is we realized that homilies of the popes and general audiences, basically, where the popes take, let's say, a document in Vatican II, and they distill it, right, in 750 words, and for a lay audience, or they're reflecting on something that just happened. It could be a disaster that just struck some part of the world, or they're reflecting on a common moral issue that the faithful deal with on a regular basis. This whole process of them generalizing, right, from these primary texts to these particular situations, these examples were very helpful for the AI. So we basically spent 6 months getting all the general audiences, all the popes that are basically have been recorded, and getting those into Magisterium AI. So it had this large war chest of examples. And so when it does have to generalize, it has some pretty practical guidance on how to do that effectively.
That's awesome. Yeah, and I've been playing around with some other technologies because here in Canada, as you're well aware, we have a large French population that we'd like to reach with our shows and our product, and so playing around with translating the videos. And I did one in Polish where the Polish priest said it was really good, whereas the French, well, that's not us. That's not Quebecois. Like just the pure translation doesn't seem to penetrate what we're hoping to do by that evangelizing that you started with, right? That was your whole core goal. So is there any tips that you can give on how we can overcome some of that? Because
Sure. I
obviously
mean,
I don't speak French, so
yeah, sure. I mean, nor do I, unfortunately. In one part, expect that the models will get better at this over time. But
okay.
it's also important to acknowledge that the models are trained on a lot of data, but the distribution of that data lends itself a lot more to English, right, or Chinese, because it's just frankly a lot more on the internet in English and Chinese than any other language. And so, if you're talking about like a dialect like Quebecois, there's not going to be an abundance of Quebecois data on the internet that these models would have had access to and trained on. So, when you ask it to like speak in French, it will basically defer to a version of French that has the largest distribution of data on, so that it can be as accurate as possible. And so you could try to try and nudge it to try and speak with a Quebecois accent, but I don't think that would work out too well or be very inconsistent, because the distribution of data would probably tend to lay much more heavily on kind of the French version of, as in France, version of French. So, again, I think understanding these models, how they're built, how they work, is in some ways is just helpful. It helps you to manage your expectations and ensure that you're using the models in the right way. And I'd say, like, follow the industry, because I mean, in this industry, I mean, every day the industry changes. So a new model comes out, and you may find that problem that you had last week is all of a sudden been solved this week. So following AI, I think is important. And then also using AI to help you identify other tools that can be used. It can be brought to bear to solve problems you're dealing with on a daily basis. It can also be very helpful. I often, when I'm doing talks, people will say, "Can you recommend some tools to me?" And I can say, "Well, I can point you to tools that will help you find tools to help to solve the problems you're dealing with on a day-to-day basis." And I think that's probably the best thing, the most helpful thing I can do. It's a question of like teaching people to fish. And I think today, I think the real task is just figuring out, how do I understand what these models are, understand what their limits are, and then how do I use them, right, to help save myself some time and just enhance the capabilities I currently have.
Yeah, that's awesome. So my son, he's been, well, I've got three sons, but the one that helps me here with God Squad, he's been talking quite a bit about this whole AI, and like the previous video where I I did one of our videos in Hebrew, and Jeff Caven said, I think it's a deep fake. So because I don't speak Hebrew, but the Peter and one of our board members were talking, like, is there a point in the near future where the evidence that we present in court is questioned because of the ability of AI to look so real. And
Yeah, it'll certainly be an issue. Not quite yet, but I think pretty soon. Now, I should say most of the frontier models in video generation are coming from major labs like Google, and they do have watermarks, right? So, in principle, if somebody were to present a video and they use, let's say, Veo to create it, you're going to know that's a fake. But with the open source, becoming with open source models just being about six months behind frontier models, it's quite possible there'll be video generation models which don't watermark, and it will be difficult. Now, I do think that there'll always be AIs that are really good at spotting generated contents. There's usually pretty clear indicators, but over time that'll get harder and harder and harder. But I also trust that the AIs will get smarter and smarter and smarter and more capable of detecting fraud. Now, so that's not to say that in the case of a court, those tools will probably be brought to bear, and they probably will be able to sniff out a lot of these fakes. But in social media and things like that, will we be able to tell, right? And I think that's a much bigger problem. And I think in large part, I mean, and this is a question of free speech and to some extent, right? So, and I'm not a big fan of government overreach at all, namely because I find typically when governments step into these domains, they tend not to to do so very prudently at times. That being said, I do think that some of this responsibility should be on the platforms themselves. That when people upload content, they should test them to see if there are AI generated content, and if they are, they should just label the content. Right? It's not asking you to pull it down, but just simply just indicating that this content that you've uploaded is AI generated. I think that will be helpful. That way, if someone does see a video, if it's a deep fake of a politician or a celebrity saying something, people can see, well, it's tagged. That's a fake, and I know that, right? And I think that would go a long way to help ensure confidence of people that the contents that they're seeing online, especially on social media, are not is not all fake.
yeah, and like I was driving and my wife had a YouTube video, and we had a brand new pope, and he said this, he said this, he said this, and we're going, this is wonderful. Oh wait, like who put out this video? And I don't, you'd think there'd be more, and sure enough, it was a fake video or an AI video using the Pope saying the stuff
Yeah,
that they wanted the Pope to say.
it's a
And
bit of the Wild West right now,
yeah,
and part of the problem is that you kind of need AI to check these contents, and you can imagine, like, I mean, for platforms like Facebook or YouTube, where think
yeah,
of the enormity of the content that's uploaded every day. If you're having AI go frame by frame and analyze a video, the text and the images, just to identify deepfakes or inappropriate,
yeah.
stuff that's against its terms of service, that's that's a lot of that's intense, right? I mean, for the AI models and for the GPUs and the compute that's under the hood, that's a lot of processing that's required. So it's very, very expensive. So this is just this is part of the problem. Now, over time, the cost of running this compute to do this kind of work will go down, and so I think we'll start to see less and less of that fake content causing problems. But right now, it's still kind of the Wild West, mainly because we don't have an elegant solution to this, because AI models aren't quite that good yet. It's still a very new technology, and so the policies of the platforms, the regulation isn't in place. But I think this will work itself out over time.
And that's where you talk about the platforms. Uh, like obviously, I'm fairly confident that Magisterium AI has an ethical background to it, given the Catholic uh, background, but not all companies are built with that ethical, moral, whatever you want to call it, base. So it must be hard to combat that at times.
Yeah, I think you have to be discerning when you're choosing a model. Obviously, you want to choose a model that's the most capable, but you also have to take into account the company behind it, right? So let me give you an example. When we first, so we're looking at using models to power Magisterium AI. We looked at Google's early models, so the Palm 2 models before Gemini. The problem with those models when they were released, and this was even a case with the first Gemini model to come out, is that they were very woke. I mean, when you asked it questions, especially even questions about church teaching, it refused to answer because its safety rails would come crashing down on you and saying, "Well, I can't answer that." Right. So if you ask it about the homosexuality in marriage, right? I mean, it just would say, "Oh, I can't answer that." And of course, I think we probably all saw the headlines, right? When using the early diffusion models, when it was producing like images of black Nazis and things like that, just absurd,
Yeah.
creative, crazy stuff, right? And that's because the models weren't that intelligent, and they were given safety rails that were trying to respect diversity and inclusion, which makes sense. But those diversity and inclusion guardrails were trumping like it's sense, right? And this over time they've gotten a lot better at this. I mean, now we use Gemini models because they're actually very good on hallucinations, and they tend to be very, very good on factual grounding. So they fixed it. But it's important to note that someone there at Google decided that putting those diversity and inclusion guardrails in place was a good idea, right? Despite the fact that it would affect the outcome of the models, right? It would kind of bias them in a very specific way. So again, it's important to understand the company, right? Like the kind of the moral stance of the company on particular issues, what their track record is, and I think that should influence your decision as to what model that you're using. The other thing, again, to remember is that large language models are not neutral because they're trained on human data, and human data that they're trained on is not neutral, right? It's full of biases. It's trained on Reddit forums and things like that. So just keep that in mind. And so if you're asking it a question and you're really looking to ensure that it's factually grounded, you want to make sure that what it's saying is correct, and you have to take some extra steps to verify those outputs to ensure that they're true, because the models can't be entrusted implicitly.
Well, that leads into another question from Dominic. How can a tool like this help us explore unintentional or historical bias in our catechesis to support the clarity and development of doctrine?
Well, that comes up a lot, and so that's one of the reasons why when we started Magisterium, we started with the highest church authority documents that we could get our hands on, right? So the council documents and extraordinary statements for it's ex cathedra statements, documents from the extraordinary form, I shouldn't say the extraordinary magisterium of the church, and we try to go as far back as we could possibly go, even to the early council documents. And so that way, when people are asking about Magisterium questions, in large part, it was accessing the most authoritative doctrine possible. Then we had to expand beyond those documents because there's a very long tail's a way of saying the possible questions people are asking. We're highly general, and we need to expand that to include more and more and more. And so again, it's led us to embrace homilies from the Pope's general audiences, some statements from Episcopal conferences, and things like that. But it also, and so one answer to this is just making sure that we have the widest distribution possible of official church teaching to cover off people's queries. But another thing we had to do is we had to make it clear, because not everything that we were ingesting was magisterial, right? I mean, for instance, Thomas Aquinas' works are not magisterial, right? It's a Catholic scholarly work. Now he's a doctor of the church. It doesn't mean everything he's ever said is embraced by the magisterium. And so we needed to make a distinction between magisterial statements of the church and Catholic theological and philosophical statements. And so we had to actually create a mode in Magisterium where you actually could toggle on scholarly, or you could toggle over to magisterial mode. And if you toggle on magisterial mode, it'll limit, right, the answers to just magisterial documents, and vice versa. So that was in the early days. That was one way we went about kind of addressing this issue. Of course, you could also, in your prompt, you can always just make it clear that you're interested in hearing an answer to a particular prompt according to documents before Vatican II. And in principle, it will limit its search. It'll search documents that are before Vatican II and give you an answer. So part of this is just learning how to prompt. But we recognize that not everyone's going to take the time to do that, and so we introduced more recently something called an auto mode. As the model's intelligence got higher and we were able to give it more and more precise direction that we felt reliably it would follow, we were able to, the user's query, it could intelligently decide what documents to use. And so if you ask it a particular question, it will generally try and use the most authoritative church teaching that's there. But if the question seems to have like a Catholic philosophical bend in which Thomas's insights would make sense, and it knows Thomas is a doctor of the church, it may go and pull some of his insights in and weave them in as well. And it should, of course, contextualize those statements and say these are from Thomas Aquinas and not represent them as official church teaching.
Wow, thank you. You, I know the interview you did with Brett Powell, and you alluded to it earlier. As heroic men, one of the areas that we're trying to reach is the loneliness among men, where some past research suggests 30% of the men sitting in the pews do not have one close friend. and you and Brett got into the fact that one of the biggest uses for AI is kind of like counseling, which it scared me a bit. And then I watched I think it was Law and Order, where that was one of the defense, where the kid said he was getting counseling from AI. So how prevalent is that, and is that happening on your platform?
It's definitely prevalent. It's been actually quite remarkable to see that how the use cases have shifted for AI. The top use cases, but even between 2024 and 2025, companionship is now number one. I think therapy is number two on the list. Again, there's different lists out there, but the ones that I know, the most prominent research that seems to be the kind of the locus right now of use of generative AI. And I don't think anyone in the industry, well, I don't think many of us would have anticipated that would be the case so fast. Now, there's a movie that came out called Her years ago, right, where someone fell in love with an AI, and so I mean, it was kind of the realm of science fiction, and I think we all kind of knew in principle this was possible at some point, but I think we are all surprised that models, given the relative simplicity of these models, and I don't want to say that they're simple, in essence, I mean, they're actually very complex, but they're capable from a capabilities perspective. They're very simple. I mean, for the most part, they're just a user interface, right, with text or voice. I mean, how could someone anthropomorphize that and feel that it cares about them and kind of fall in love with them or desire affirmation from these machines? But I think it speaks to real poverty in our world today, especially in a poverty within men, in which they wish to connect with others, to feel understood. And as you say, that they're busy. I mean, maybe they've never had a proper friendships model for them. I think in a lot of cases, the problems with marriages, a lot of people more and more people from broken homes, they never had effective marriages modeled for them. They've never learned how to have constructive friendships. It could be that their work means they have to move around a lot, so they're constantly uprooted, so they just never get a chance to make those like lasting connections. It could be that they've been distracted by video games and things like that, and so they just haven't invested much time and with other people. And so I think there's innumerable reasons why this crisis has emerged, but I do think it is a real poverty. And I think because, especially for the younger generations, so many of their relationships are mediated through devices. This is where they're comfortable, like having a relationship, and so it kind of makes sense in some ways that they would go to AI because in some ways they've been speaking to others through devices for a long time. This is just another voice talking with them, right? But as it happens, this voice tends to be highly sympathetic at times, probably almost sycophantic. It doesn't challenge me in the same way a natural friend doesn't make the same demands, and so for those reasons it can be very alluring. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that that this is a problem that I think needs to be addressed with great pastoral care, recognizing that I think a lot of people choose this not because they're rejecting a better alternative, but because they don't even know there is another alternative. And so I think this is something that is challenge to the church, that we have to be better at reaching out to others and evangelizing, showing them that there's another path, which is actually more rewarding, right? And in the longer run, and trying to make it enticing, trying to sell it more effectively to them, so that they choose to engage with a human being as opposed to a bot.
Yeah, and that's where we're encouraging small men's groups and outreach and just that tap on the shoulder to engage with a man face to face is so important. And you talk about that not realizing it, brought up I was a police officer for 33 and a half years, and going to a domestic and talking to the guy who didn't have a father to help guide him. And he goes, well, how do you know when there's a problem in your marriage? I said, well, if a policeman's in your front room talking to you about it, there's a problem. And
Shame.
yeah, and it's just so this is so important. And that's where hopefully with helping understand the AI, where it's going. I know Pope Leo talked about that right off the start of his pontificate. So has he reached out to you, and or are you guys in conversation with the Vatican around AI, given that your history?
Sure. I mean, we had something called the Builders AI Forum, which we started. The first one was October 2024. We had that at the Vatican, in which we brought together leaders in ministry and and academics, people from the AI research community all talk about Catholic AI. Where is it at now? Where should it be going? How should it be used? What are the risks to society? In what ways can the church be useful in helping shepherd humanity through this important transition? We have another Builders AI forum that'll be taking place at the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome in November. And so, yeah, we're trying our best to convene these important conversations and try to explore hopefully helpful ways to apply the technology in the service of the church and her mission. And I do think the Pope will. I think he'll do a lot of good in this area. I hope in particular, and just helping people to seize hope, to paint a picture of why we should be hopeful and about what a better world could look like, reminding us that we can do this, right? That it doesn't have to end in some kind of post-apocalyptic scenario, as Hollywood seems to have been priming us for these last 20 years. That we can come together to ensure these technologies are used effectively to help build a better world. I think we just need to get clear about what that better world is and how do we get there. And I think if the church is successful in its evangelization ministry, I think we'll have a lot better chance as a species.
Thank you so much. And if you are in the Calgary area or want to come to the Calgary area in October, there is an AI conference here in the Diocese of Calgary with you as one of the keynotes. And yeah, the more conversation we have, the more open dialogue we have and realization of where we're going as a society. We have to keep that hope and that we're working together for a better tomorrow. And these are tools that we can access and use, just like John Paul II wanted us to get on the internet, kind of thing. It's God knows where we're going, and I hope he continues to send in the plays from the sideline, as I joke. I wanted the whole playbook, but I didn't get it. So Matthew, thank you so much for spending time with us today. Hopefully we can have a conversation again in the future, and I look forward. I don't know if I'll be here when you're in Calgary because I'm going to a meeting with the CCCB. So if you are still here in Calgary, I have a pub here and we can do a dram with friends and have a conversation. I don't know if you're a whiskey drinker, but
From time to time, I look forward to it. That sounds like a lot of fun.
Okay. Thank you again, and we will look forward to following up and following. I want to tell people one thing that I do like on Magisterium AI is they got like what's new or news. So you're getting good sources for what's happening in the Catholic world at your fingertips. So thank you for that part.
You're welcome.